A heartless millionaire, notorious for his lack of empathy, compels his black Maid to sing at a high society event, hoping to make her a laughingstock. Instead, her soulful performance moves the audience to tears, leading to an unexpected change in their perception of her and him. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Richard Stokes' penthouse in Manhattan's Upper East Side. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Central Park, its autumn colors muted by the approaching dusk. The space buzzed with activity as caterers and event staff moved efficiently through the 5,000-square-foot apartment, preparing for tonight's charity gala. Richard stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his custom-made Tom Ford tuxedo. At 52, he cut an imposing figure, tall, lean, with silver-streaked dark hair and hard gray eyes that reflected years of calculated business decisions. His movements were precise, practiced, the result of countless high-society events where appearance meant everything. "Stevens," he called out to his butler, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority. "Has everyone arrived for the pre-event briefing?" "Yes, sir. The staff is assembled in the service area, including the new housekeeper, Clara." Richard's lip curled slightly at the mention of Clara. She'd been hired 2 weeks ago, and something about her quiet dignity irritated him. Perhaps it was the way she maintained eye contact a fraction too long, or how she carried herself with an understated confidence that seemed inappropriate for her position. In the kitchen, the staff stood in a neat line, waiters in crisp black uniforms, bartenders reviewing wine lists, and Clara, wearing a simple black dress that marked her as household staff. Richard entered, immediately commanding attention. The air grew tenser with each click of his Italian leather shoes against the marble floor. Tonight's guest list includes the CEO of Goldman Sachs, 3 state senators, and the publisher of the New York Times, Richard announced, pacing before them. "I expect perfection. One mistake," his eyes lingered on Clara, "and you'll be looking for new employment before midnight." The staff nodded, their faces carefully neutral. Only Clara maintained that steady gaze that made Richard's jaw tighten. He approached her, standing close enough to make most people step back. She didn't move. "You'll be managing the coat check," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Think you can handle that without losing any six-figure furs?" "Yes, Mr. Stokes," Clara replied, her voice steady. "I managed coat check operations at the Metropolitan Opera House for 3 years. Richard's eyes narrowed at her response. It wasn't insubordinate, but it hinted at competence beyond what he'd assumed. The other staff members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the brewing tension. As guests began arriving, Richard transformed. His smile became practiced charm, his laugh carefully modulated to convey just the right amount of warmth. He guided conversations with the skill of a conductor, highlighting his recent acquisition of a struggling tech company and his plans to streamline its operations, a euphemism for the mass layoffs he had planned. The penthouse filled with New York's elite, their jewelry catching the light from crystal chandeliers, their conversations a carefully orchestrated dance of power and influence. Richard moved among them like a shark through shallow waters, always aware of who might be useful and who could be discarded. He noticed Clara efficiently managing the coat check, her movements graceful and professional. Something about her composure continued to needle him. When he overheard a guest compliment her handling of a complicated coat mix-up, an idea formed, one that would remind everyone of their proper PLA. See in his world. The night progressed, fueled by expensive champagne and even more expensive promises. Richard waited for the perfect moment, when the crowd was warm with alcohol and the artificial camaraderie of wealth. He caught Clara's eye and beckoned her over, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes. The room quieted as he raised his hand, commanding attention with the ease of someone accustomed to power. The stage was set for his calculated humiliation, though none of the guests yet realized what was about to unfold. Clara stood in the center of Richard's expansive living room, surrounded by New York's elite. The silence felt heavy, expectant. Among the sea of unfamiliar faces, she caught sight of Lisa Martinez, her best friend who worked as a paralegal for one of the law firms represented at the gala. Lisa's presence was unexpected, a friendly face in hostile territory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of public speaking. "My housekeeper here tells me she used to work at the Metropolitan Opera House." He paused for effect, swirling the champagne in his crystal flute. "Surely someone with such prestigious experience wouldn't mind favoring us with a song?" Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the deliberate cruelty in Richard's suggestion. Others leaned forward, eager for the entertainment of watching someone squirm. Clara's hands, normally steady, trembled slightly at her sides. The room seemed to shrink, the expensive artwork on the walls blurring at the edges of her vision. She felt the weight of countless similar moments, times when people in power had tried to diminish her, expecting her to break. Lisa caught her eye from across the room. They'd met 5 years ago at a community center in Harlem, where they both volunteered teaching literacy classes. Lisa gave an almost imperceptible nod, her expression fierce with support. In that moment, Clara remembered their late-night conversations about dignity, about refusing to let others define your worth. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Richard's smile began to falter, just slightly, as Clara remained quiet. He hadn't expected this composed resistance. "Well," he prompted, an edge creeping into his voice. "We're waiting." Clara took a deep breath, her spine straightening. She thought of her grandmother, who had cleaned houses in Georgia but never let anyone make her feel small. She thought of the choir at her church, where she'd learned that music could be both a shield and a weapon. When she opened her mouth to sing, she chose Amazing Grace, not the gentle version sung in quiet churches, but the raw, powerful rendition that spoke of survival and triumph. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the penthouse without any accompaniment. The first note caught the audience off guard. Several guests who had been smirking now froze, wine glasses halfway to their lips. Richard's self-satisfied expression flickered, replaced momentarily by uncertainty. Clara's voice carried years of history, the weight of struggle, the power of perseverance, the unstoppable force of dignity. She didn't look at Richard as she sang. Instead, she looked at each guest, one by one, forcing them to see her as a complete human being. The song grew in power, each verse building on the last. A woman in an expensive red dress pressed her hand to her throat, eyes glistening. An older man with a military bearing stood straighter, recognition of something profound crossing his features. Lisa watched her friend with fierce pride, remembering the nights they'd spent discussing their dreams, their fears, their determination to succeed in a world that often seemed designed to exclude them. She saw the same strength now that had drawn them together as friends. The room's atmosphere transformed. The earlier artificiality of social pleasantries gave way to something authentic and uncomfortable. Guests who had been carefully maintaining their social masks found themselves transported to memories of their own struggles, their own moments of grace. Richard stood absolutely still, his champagne forgotten in his hand. He watched as his carefully orchestrated evening of social manipulation was transformed into something entirely different. The power dynamics he'd taken for granted shifted beneath his feet like sand. Clara's voice soared through the final verse, filling every corner of the penthouse with undeniable truth. She wasn't performing for their entertainment. She was testifying to her own worth, her own humanity. The last note hung in the air, powerful and defiant. In the silence that followed, no one moved. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows, but inside, time seemed suspended. Clara stood tall, her dignity intact, even enhanced. She had taken Richard's attempt at humiliation and turned it into a moment of transformation. The first person to break the silence was an elderly woman in the back, who began to applaud with tears streaming down her face. Others joined in, the sound building until it filled the room with the same intensity as Clara's voice had moments before. Richard remained frozen, his calculated world of social hierarchy and power plays crumbling around him. He watched as his guests responded not to wealth or status, but to raw human truth. For the first time in years, he felt something crack in his carefully constructed facade. Lisa struggled to maintain her professional composure as the applause continued. Her hands shook slightly as she dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. 20 years of friendship with Clara flashed through her mind. Late nights studying for their GEDs, sharing meals when money was tight, celebrating small victories in a world that rarely acknowledged them. From her position near the back of the room, she watched the crowd's reaction. These were people she usually only saw from behind mahogany desks or across polished conference tables. Now, their carefully maintained veneers had cracked, revealing glimpses of genuine emotion. Clara's voice had done more than fill the room. It had excavated memories many of these people had buried beneath years of privilege and pretense. The song choice wasn't accidental. Amazing Grace carried centuries of history, of struggle and redemption, of pain and triumph. An older black woman in an expensive suit caught Lisa's eye and nodded slowly, a gesture of shared understanding. Both women recognized the weight of this moment. In their professional lives, they'd learned to navigate spaces where their presence was often questioned, their competence constantly tested. The song's echoes seemed to linger in the air, mixing with the memories it had stirred. A senior partner from Lisa's firm stood near the window, his usual sharp expression softened by something that looked like recognition. His daughter, Lisa knew, had recently completed rehab. Perhaps Clara's voice had touched that private pain, that hope for grace and second chances. Throughout the room, conversations began in hushed tones, different from the earlier artificial chatter. A judge spoke quietly about her grandmother, who had cleaned houses while putting herself through night school. A CEO mentioned his immigrant parents and the songs they used to sing to keep their spirits up during difficult times. Clara remained standing where she had performed, her presence commanding respect rather than seeking it. She'd transformed from invisible staff member to the evening's emotional center, though Lisa knew her friend would handle this shift with characteristic grace. Richard Stokes stood apart from the crowd, his usual confidence visibly shaken. Lisa observed him with professional interest. She'd seen his type before, men whose power had become their prison. Something in Clara's performance. He had struck a chord he hadn't expected to hear. The song had forced everyone present to confront the artificial barriers they constructed. Class, race, privilege. Clara's voice had cut through these divisions, revealing the shared humanity beneath. Lisa watched as guests who had earlier barely acknowledged the serving staff now engaged them in genuine conversation. A young analyst from Goldman Sachs approached Clara, tears still visible on her cheeks. She spoke about her own grandmother, a domestic worker who had saved every penny to send her children to college. Clara listened with the same dignity she brought to everything, offering quiet understanding rather than judgment. The atmosphere in the penthouse had fundamentally shifted. The expensive artwork on the walls, the crystal chandeliers, the imported marble floors. All these symbols of wealth and status seemed somehow diminished in importance. Clara's voice had reminded everyone present of more fundamental truths. Lisa made her way slowly through the crowd toward her friend. She noticed how people stepped aside respectfully, how their gazes now held recognition rather than dismissal. This, she knew, was what real change looked like. Not grand gestures, but small shifts in perception that could, over time, transform entire worlds. Richard remained isolated, watching the scene unfold. His earlier attempt at humiliation had backfired spectacularly, forcing him to confront something in himself. Lisa recognized the look of a man seeing his own reflection clearly for the first time in years. The evening's carefully planned schedule had dissolved. No one seemed interested in returning to the artificial pleasantries that usually characterize such events. Instead, small groups formed throughout the penthouse, engaging in conversations that felt real, necessary, overdue. Clara caught Lisa's eye and smiled slightly. Not the professional smile she wore at work, but the real one, the one that spoke of shared history and understanding. In that moment, both women recognized that something significant had shifted, though neither could yet predict where these changes would lead. The standing ovation thundered through Richard's penthouse, but he barely heard it. A strange pressure had built in his throat, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He found himself backing away from the crowd, seeking refuge in his private study, a wood-paneled room that usually represented power, but now felt like a hiding place. He loosened his bow tie, the silk suddenly feeling like a noose. The room's temperature seemed to have dropped, though the thermostat remained unchanged. Through the study's heavy door, he could still hear the murmur of conversation, drastically different from the artificial social chatter he was accustomed to hosting. Richard's hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of scotch. Not the bottle he served guests, but his private reserve, a 50-year-old Macallan that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The liquor burned, but failed to dissolve the knot in his throat. His reflection in the study's window caught his attention. Behind the expensive suit and carefully maintained appearance, he saw something else, a ghost of someone he'd almost forgotten. Jimmy Stokes, the kid from Queens who used to help his mother clean offices after school. The memory hit him with unexpected force. He remembered the smell of industrial cleaning fluid, the ache in his knees from scrubbing floors, the sound of his mother's humming as she worked, the same Clara had just sung. His mother had loved that song, used to sing it while preparing dinner in their tiny kitchen, her hands raw from cleaning chemicals. Richard sank into his leather chair, the one that had cost more than his father had made in a year driving a delivery truck. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades building walls of wealth and privilege, only to have them cracked by the same song that had once been his mother's comfort. He remembered the day he decided to reinvent himself. Fresh out of community college, he'd lied about his background on a job application, claimed a degree from a better school. That first lie had led to others, each one taking him further from Jimmy Stokes and closer to Richard Stokes, the business titan. Through the window, the city lights blurred. He reached for his pocket square, Italian silk, obscenely expensive, and pressed it against his eyes. When was the last time he cried? The day of his mother's funeral, perhaps, though he'd made sure no one saw those tears. The sounds from the main room had changed. Instead of the usual superficial laughter and networking, he heard genuine conversations, stories being shared, truths being spoken. His carefully orchestrated evening of social manipulation had transformed into something real, something he no longer controlled. He thought of Clara's face as she sang, dignified, strong, unbroken. She'd reminded him of his mother in that moment, though he'd tried to deny the recognition. Both women carried themselves with a grace that had nothing to do with wealth or status. The scotch in his glass caught the light, amber reflecting like tears. He remembered his father's words at their last meeting, before Richard had cut ties with his family. "Money's made you mean, Jimmy. Your mother would be ashamed." He dismissed those words then, buried them under achievements and acquisitions. Now, with Clara's voice still echoing in his mind, those words resurfaced. He'd spent years building his empire, crushing competitors, manipulating markets, treating people like resources to be exploited. When had he become the kind of person who would try to humiliate someone for entertainment? A knock at the study door startled him. "Mr. Stokes?" It was Stevens, his butler. "Your guests are asking for you." Richard stood, straightening his jacket automatically. His hands still trembled slightly as he adjusted his cuffs. Gold links that could pay a month's rent for most families. The man in the window's reflection looked different now, uncomfortable in his own skin. The knot in his throat hadn't dissolved. If anything, it had grown tighter. He realized it wasn't just emotion he was feeling. It was shame. Deep, genuine shame. The kind he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, to rebuild his usual facade of control. But something had shifted. Clara's voice had reached past his defenses, touching the part of him he'd tried so hard to bury. The part that remembered what it felt like to be on the other side of privilege. The penthouse buzzed with a new kind of energy as Clara found herself surrounded by guests who now looked at her with different eyes. The same people who had barely acknowledged her presence an hour ago now sought her attention, their practiced social masks replaced by genuine interest and, in some cases, shame. A prominent art gallery owner touched Clara's arm gently. "My mother," she began, then stopped to compose herself. "My mother cleaned houses in Connecticut. She used to sing that same hymn." The woman's expensive makeup couldn't hide her emotion. I've spent years pretending that wasn't part of my story. Clara accepted these confessions with quiet dignity, neither absolving nor condemning. Her performance had cracked something in the room's carefully maintained social structure, allowing buried truths to surface. She noticed how the other household staff now moved through the crowd with straighter backs, meeting guests' eyes with newfound confidence. Richard's absence was conspicuous. He had retreated to his study shortly after her performance, leaving an unusual power vacuum in the room. The typical social hierarchy of these events had dissolved, replaced by something more authentic and unpredictable. A small group had formed near the grand piano, where a hedge fund manager was speaking. G quietly about his grandfather, who had worked as a janitor at Harvard. I used to be embarrassed about that, he admitted. Now I realize he probably had more integrity than half the people I deal with daily. Lisa remained close to Clara, watching the scene unfold with both protection and pride. As a paralegal, she had attended countless similar events, always carefully navigating the invisible barriers of class and race. Now those barriers seemed more permeable, at least temporarily. The conversations throughout the room had shifted from stock prices and real estate to family histories and hidden struggles. A judge spoke about growing up in public housing. A fashion magazine editor shared stories of her first job cleaning offices. Stories that would have been carefully hidden just hours ago now emerged, carried on the lingering echoes of Clara's song. Clara felt the weight of this moment. Her voice had done more than just fill the room. It had excavated buried truths and forgotten connections. But she also recognized the fragility of such revelations. Tomorrow, many of these people would return to their offices and boardrooms, perhaps trying to forget this moment of vulnerability. From across the room, Stevens, the butler, caught her eye and gave a subtle nod of respect. The household staff had witnessed countless displays of wealth and power in this penthouse, but never anything quite like this. The usual barriers between servers and served had blurred, if only temporarily. A young woman in an expensive dress approached Clara, twisting her diamond ring nervously. "I'm on the board of the Metropolitan Opera," she said. "We have a community outreach program. Would you be interested in teaching masterclasses?" Before Clara could respond, another guest joined them, then another. Offers and business cards appeared. A position with a music education nonprofit, an invitation to perform at a charity gala, opportunities that would have seemed impossible hours ago. Clara accepted each card gracefully, neither eager nor dismissive. The air conditioning hummed softly, circulating the lingering emotional energy through the room. Conversations continued to flow, deeper and more genuine than typical gala chatter. People who usually competed for status now shared vulnerable truths about their backgrounds, their struggles, their forgotten dreams. Richard's study door remained closed, his absence increasingly noticeable as the evening progressed. Some guests glanced that way occasionally, wondering about their host's uncharacteristic retreat. His attempt to humiliate Clara had backfired spectacularly, forcing everyone, including himself, to confront uncomfortable truths. Clara maintained her composure, the same quiet dignity that had first irritated Richard now drawing people to her. She had transformed from invisible servant to the evening's moral center, though she carried this shift with characteristic grace. She knew that real change required more than one moment of emotional connection, no matter how powerful. The city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a reminder of the world beyond this penthouse. A world where the barriers and prejudices momentarily breached here still stood firm. Yet something had shifted, if only in the realm of possibility. Richard finally emerged from his study, his usual commanding presence diminished. The penthouse he designed to showcase his wealth now felt foreign to him. Every expensive detail a reminder of the distance he'd created between himself and his origins. He moved through the crowd like a ghost in his own home. As he approached Clara's vicinity, Charles Warner, CEO of a major investment firm, intercepted him. "Richard, we need to discuss the Mitchell merger." Warner's voice carried its usual aggressive enthusiasm, jarringly out of place in the evening's transformed atmosphere. "I've got some concerns about the workforce reduction numbers." Richard found him, self-staring at Warner's animated gestures, hearing terms like downsizing and efficiency metrics that had once been his native language. Now each word felt hollow, echoing with the cost in human terms he'd spent years ignoring. His eyes drifted past Warner to where Clara stood, still surrounded by guests but maintaining her characteristic poise. "Charles," Richard interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Not tonight." He moved a step around Warner, but the CEO grabbed his arm. "This is millions we're talking about, Richard. Since when do you put off business?" Warner's face showed genuine confusion. They'd done countless deals over late-night whiskey, planning corporate raids that would leave hundreds jobless. The room's atmosphere had split into two distinct currents. In one corner, Clara continued engaging with guests in genuine conversation about family histories and forgotten dreams. In the other, Warner's increasingly loud business talk created a bubble of the old world, of profit margins and power plays. Richard stood frozen between these two realities. The man he'd been this morning would have automatically gravitated toward Warner's familiar territory of deals and dominance. Now, that path felt like a step backward into a darker room. A server passed with a tray of champagne. Richard noticed how Warner barely acknowledged her existence, the same way he himself had treated his staff just hours ago. The same way he'd treated Clara before her song had cracked his carefully constructed world. "Mr. Stokes?" Stevens appeared at his elbow. Miss Clara asked for a brief break. She stepped out onto the terrace. The butler's tone was professional, but his eyes held meaning. He'd served Richard for 15 years and had never seen his employer hesitate like this. Warner was still talking, pulling out his phone to show spreadsheets. "Look at these projections. If we move fast, we can clear out the entire Midwest division before." His voice faded as Richard stepped away, leaving him mid-sentence. The crowd parted slightly as Richard moved toward the terrace doors. He caught fragments of conversations, real conversations, not the usual social performances. A Supreme Court judge was crying quietly as she spoke about her grandmother. A real estate mogul had rolled up his sleeves, showing knife scars from his first job as a dishwasher. But Clara had already moved from the terrace by the time he reached it. The night air carried a chill, and the city spread out below like a carpet of lights. Richard stood at the railing, remembering nights from his childhood when he'd looked up at buildings like this one, dreaming of rising above his circumstances. He'd achieved that dream, but at what cost? The knot in his throat tightened again. Behind him, through the glass doors, he could see his guests continuing their unusual evening of authentic connection. The artificial social hierarchy he'd carefully maintained had crumbled, replaced by something more genuine and unpredictable. Clara had reappeared in the main room, now speaking with a group that included both guests and household staff. The usual invisible barriers between servers and served had dissolved. Even Stevens, normally the picture of professional detachment, was engaged in conversation with a prominent publisher about their shared roots in Georgia. Richard straightened his tie, a gesture that had always given him confidence. But the expensive silk offered no comfort now. He'd spent decades building walls of wealth and privilege, only to have them breached by a song that reminded him of who he used to be. The evening continued its unprecedented course. In one corner, Warner stood alone, looking bewildered as his attempts to discuss business were politely but firmly deflected by people more interested in sharing personal truths than discussing profit margins. The path to Clara seemed simultaneously clear and impossibly complex. Richard took a step toward the doors, then hesitated. For the first time in years, he didn't know how to navigate his own social space. The usual tools of power and position meant nothing in this transformed environment. The rooftop garden, typically a showcase of carefully manicured luxury, felt different in the evening air. Clara stood among the meticulously arranged topiaries and imported flowers, her hands resting on the glass balustrade. The city stretched before her, a tapestry of lights and shadows, while behind her, the muffled sounds of the transformed party filtered through the glass doors. Richard found her there, her silhouette outlined against the Manhattan skyline. He hesitated at the entrance, suddenly unsure of his footing in this space he owned but no longer seemed to control. The usual confidence that carried him through hostile takeovers and board meetings had abandoned him. "Clara," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. She turned slightly, acknowledging his presence without fully facing him. The distant sound of traffic rose from 50 stories below, filling the silence between them. "Mr. Stokes," she responded, her voice neutral but firm. "I believe the guests are waiting for you inside." "They can wait." He took a step forward, then stopped as she tensed visibly. The space between them felt charged with unspoken accusations. "I wanted to what?" Clara interrupted, finally turning to face him fully. "To apologize? To ease your conscience?" Her composed exterior cracked slightly, revealing a flash of the hurt and anger beneath. "You tried to humiliate me in front of your guests. That's who you are, Mr. Stokes. One song doesn't change that." Richard flinched at the truth in her words. The carefully prepared speech he'd composed in his study dissolved. Instead, different words emerged, surprising him with their rawness. "Jimmy," he said quietly. "My mother used to call me Jimmy." Clara's expression shifted slightly, but she remained silent, waiting. "She cleaned offices in Manhattan," he continued, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Night shift. I used to help her after school. She loved that hymn you sang. Used to hum it while she worked." He moved to the balustrade, keeping a respectful distance from Clara. "I haven't thought about that in years." The city hummed below them, indifferent to the moment unfolding in the garden. Clara watched him, her face unreadable. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I buried Jimmy Stokes under Ralph Lauren suits and Morgan Stanley accounts. Created Richard Stokes, the man who—" He gestured vaguely at the penthouse behind them, "who would try to humiliate someone for entertainment." And now, Clara's voice remained steady, but something had shifted in her stance. "Now," Richard laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Now I don't know who I am." Your voice, it brought everything back. Things I've spent decades trying to forget. He loosened his bow tie, suddenly feeling suffocated. "My father's last words to me were that money had made me mean. I fired him from the maintenance staff of my first company a week later." Clara's silence felt heavy, judgment and understanding mixed in equal measure. The sounds of genuine conversation continued to drift from the penthouse. Conversations about struggle, about family, about forgotten roots. "I don't want your confession, Mr. Stokes," Clara finally said. "Guilt without action is just self-indulgence." "Then what do you want?" "The same thing I wanted when I started working here. To be treated with dignity. To be seen as human." She turned to face him fully. "Your wealth didn't make you mean. Your choices did. Every time you decided that your money made you better than the people who serve you. Every time you chose to forget where you came from." Richard absorbed her words like physical blows. The perfectly trimmed roses around them suddenly seemed artificial, like everything else he'd built. "I don't know how to be Jimmy anymore," he admitted quietly. "Maybe that's not the point," Clara responded. "Maybe the point is to stop being so afraid of him that you have to destroy everyone who reminds you of who you were." A siren wailed in the distance, its echo bouncing between skyscrapers. Inside, the party continued its unprecedented course, wealth and status temporarily surrendering to authentic human connection. Richard gripped the balustrade, his knuckles white. Decades of carefully constructed identity were crumbling, and he didn't know what would remain when the dust settled. Clara watched him, neither helping nor hindering, maintaining the dignity he had failed to respect. The rooftop garden's ambient lighting cast soft shadows as Richard and Clara's conversation shifted into deeper territory. The mechanical hum of HVAC units provided a quiet undertone to their words, a reminder of the practical realities that kept luxury buildings functioning. "Tell me about your mother," Clara said unexpectedly, her voice softer but no less dignified. She remained at a distance, but her stance had relaxed slightly. Richard's hand moved to his pocket, where he'd kept his mother's worn prayer card for 30 years, though he'd never admit this to his business associates. "She worked herself to death," he said finally. "Literally. Heart attack while cleaning the executive floor at Lehman Brothers. I was already a junior trader there, but I told everyone she was someone else's mother." Clara absorbed this information without visible reaction, though her eyes narrowed slightly. And now you own the building. Bought it in the 2008 crash. Richard laughed hollowly. Renamed it Stokes Tower. My mother would have cleaned it for 40 years and never made enough to buy a single floor. Is that why you treat your staff the way you do? Punishing them for reminding you of her? The question hung in the air like smoke. Through the glass doors, they could see Lisa observing their interaction while maintaining a respectful distance. Her protective instinct toward Clara was evident, even from afar. I think, Richard began slowly, I've spent so long being afraid of becoming nothing that I forgot how to be something real. He loosened his tie completely, letting it hang like surrender. When I saw you, your dignity, your refusal to be diminished, it was like seeing her ghost. Mr. Stokes, Clara said, her voice firm but not unkind. Your mother's ghost isn't in me. It's in every cruel word you've spoken to people you consider beneath you. In every time you've used your power to make others feel powerless. The truth of her words hit him with physical force. Inside the penthouse, the unusual evening continued to unfold. Guests who normally discussed hedge funds were sharing stories of childhood struggles. The artificial barriers of class and status remained temporarily dissolved. I want to change, Richard said quietly, surprising himself with the admission. I don't know how, but I know I can't go back to being who I was this morning. Clara studied him for a long moment. Change isn't a moment, Mr. Stokes. It's a practice. It's choosing differently every day, especially when it's difficult. Will you help me? The question came out before he could stop it. No, Clara replied, but without anger. That's not my role. My job is to clean your home, not your conscience. But I will continue to work here, doing my job with dignity, as long as you respect that dignity. Lisa appeared at the garden entrance, her protective instinct finally overriding her professional discretion. Clara, are you okay? Clara nodded, her composure unshaken. We're having an honest conversation, Lisa. Maybe the first one in this building. Richard watched the interaction between the two friends, seeing the years of shared struggle and support in their silent communication. He thought of his own friendships, mostly strategic alliances, built on mutual benefit rather than genuine connection. Your song, he said suddenly, it wasn't just about grace, was it? It was about the courage to remain whole in a world that tries to break you into pieces. It was about truth, Mr. Stokes. The kind you can't hide from, no matter how many towers you build. Lisa moved closer, her legal training evident in how she positioned herself, ready to intervene if necessary. But the tension in the garden had transformed into something else, something more like the beginning of understanding. I'd like to make things right, Richard said, carefully choosing his words. Not just with you, but with everyone I've... He trailed off, the magnitude of his past behavior finally hitting him. Start with yourself, Clara suggested. The rest will follow. The city stretched out below them, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. In one small rooftop garden, 3 people stood in a moment of transition. The familiar hierarchies of power temporarily suspended by the simple, devastating power of truth. As Richard, Clara, and Lisa returned to the main room, the atmosphere had crystallized into something unprecedented in the penthouse's history. The usual end-of-evening ritual of strategic goodbyes and business card exchanges had been replaced by something more authentic. Richard moved to the center of the room, his presence drawing attention, but differently than before. Gone was the practiced authority, replaced by something more vulnerable and, paradoxically, more powerful. He cleared his throat, waiting as conversations quieted. I owe you all an apology, he began, his voice carrying none of its usual performative confidence. Especially you, Clara. Heads turned toward her, standing dignified near Lisa. I brought you all here tonight to witness what I thought would be an amusing moment of humiliation. Instead, you witnessed my own. The room held its breath. Several guests who had already called their drivers canceled their cars, sensing the importance of the moment. Stevens, the butler, stood straighter, his professional mask slipping to reveal careful attention. I've spent decades building walls of wealth and privilege, Richard continued, convincing myself that success meant leaving behind everything and everyone that reminded me of where I came from. He paused, fighting the urge to fall back on his usual polished rhetoric. Tonight, Clara's voice broke through those walls. A prominent civil rights attorney who had been quietly observing all evening stepped forward. "Richard, I've attended your gatherings for years. This is the first real thing I've ever heard you say." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The usual sycophantic responses were absent, replaced by genuine engagement. "My company," Richard said, his voice strengthening, "has been known for aggressive acquisitions and efficient streamlining." The corporate euphemisms felt sour in his mouth now. "Starting tomorrow, that changes. I'm announcing a new initiative focusing on corporate responsibility and community investment." Clara watched him carefully, her expression neither approving nor disapproving. She understood that promises made in moments of emotional revelation needed the test of time and action. "I'm establishing a foundation," Richard continued, "dedicated to supporting education and arts programs in underserved communities." "Clara," he turned to her, "I'd like you to be on the board. Not as my employee, but as someone who understands the power of voice, in every sense of the word." Lisa stepped closer to her friend, protective instincts still active. But Clara stood firm, meeting Richard's gaze with steady consideration. The guests, many of them powerful figures in their own right, had begun discussing among themselves. A hedge fund manager offered to match Richard's foundation funding. The civil rights attorney volunteered legal support. The Metropolitan Opera Board MEM.BR renewed her offer of community program involvement. "Real change," Clara finally spoke, her voice carrying the same quiet power it had during her song, "requires more than promises made in emotional moments, Mr. Stokes." "I know," Richard acknowledged. "That's why I'm asking for help from all of you." He gestured to include everyone in the room, not just with donations, but with genuine commitment to change, starting with how we treat every person in our lives, regardless of their position. The household staff, who had been watching from the periphery, straightened. Stevens caught Clara's eye and nodded slightly. He had seen something shift in his employer of 15 years. "The foundation is just a start," Richard continued. "Each of us here has power to affect change in our own spheres. We've all built walls around our wealth, our privilege, our hearts. Tonight showed us what's possible when those walls come down." A young analyst who had been quietly crying spoke up. "My mother," she said, her voice trembling, "works as a housekeeper in Boston. I've never told anyone at the firm. I was too ashamed. None of us should be ashamed of where we came from," Richard responded, the words feeling like release. "Our shame should be reserved for forgetting." The evening was drawing to a close, but not in the usual way. Instead of rushing to private cars, guests lingered, exchanging real contact information, making genuine plans for collaboration and change. The artificial barriers that usually define such gatherings remained dissolved. Clara stood with Lisa, watching as the evening's transformation continued to ripple outward. "Think anything will really change?" Lisa asked quietly. "Some things already have," Clara responded, her eyes on Richard as he engaged in genuine conversation with a member of his cleaning staff. "The rest depends on what happens tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that." 3 months after the gala, Richard sat in his office at Stokes Tower, staring at an email that threatened to shatter everything. Marcus Reynolds, his former business partner, had attached documents detailing years of corporate manipulation, worker exploitation, and illegal financial practices, all bearing Richard's signature. $10 million by midnight, the email concluded, or this goes to the SEC and every major news outlet. Your little redemption story ends tomorrow, Jimmy. Richard's hands shook as he closed the laptop. The foundation he'd established after the gala night was making real progress. Community arts programs were flourishing, educational initiatives were showing promise, and his company's new ethical business practices had started gaining positive attention. But beneath this transformation lay years of buried crimes. Workers displaced by hostile takeovers, pensions emptied through legal loopholes, communities destroyed by predatory development. His past was a mountain of calculated cruelty, documented in endless spreadsheets and contracts. His office phone buzzed. "Mr. Stokes," his secretary's voice wavered, "Clara Martinez is here with several people. They're insisting on seeing you." Before he could respond, his office door opened. Clara entered, followed by Lisa, now wearing a federal prosecutor's badge and several FBI agents. The transformation in Clara's bearing was subtle but unmistakable. Gone was any trace of the housekeeper role she'd played. "Richard Stokes," Lisa began formally, "we've been building a case against your company's practices for the past 2 years. Clara has been working undercover as part of our investigation." The room seemed to tilt. Richard looked at Clara, seeing her now with new clarity. The dignity he'd mistaken for unusual in a housekeeper had been that of a trained investigator. The musical background that had made her performance so powerful wasn't coincidental. It was part of a carefully constructed cover. "Your redemption at the gala, Clara SP." Oak, her voice carrying the same strength it had that night, but now with a different undertone. It seemed genuine. "That's why we waited, watching to see if your changes were real." "They were real," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse. "Are real." "We know," Lisa replied. "That's why we're here now, instead of letting you read about your indictment in tomorrow's papers." Marcus Reynolds contacted us an hour ago, trying to leverage his knowledge for immunity. Richard slumped in his chair, years of carefully constructed facades crumbling. "Everything I've done since that night, the foundation, the changes in company policy, were genuine," Clara finished. "We've been watching closely. You've actually started making a difference. That's why we're offering you a choice." Lisa stepped forward, placing a thick document on his desk. "Full cooperation, complete disclosure of all past illegal activities, a structured repayment and restitution program for affected communities. You'll face charges, but with a chance to continue your legitimate reform efforts." The city stretched out beyond his office windows. The same view he'd once used to symbolize his power, now feeling like a reminder of his responsibility. "The foundation," he asked quietly, "can continue its work," Clara answered, "under new oversight, but maintaining its mission. The good you started doesn't have to end, Richard, but it has to be built on truth, not hidden crimes." Richard looked at the document, then at Clara. "That night, when you sang, was any of it real?" "All of it," she replied without hesitation. "My background, my understanding of struggle, my voice, those are real. So is your response. That's why we're here, offering a path forward instead of just executing a warrant." The weight of decades of decisions pressed down on him. "I spent so long running from Jimmy Stokes," he said quietly. "Created this whole empire to bury him. And now you have a chance to make things right," Lisa interjected. "Not just with public gestures, but with real accountability." Richard reached for the document with trembling hands. Outside his office, he could hear the normal sounds of business continuing. Phones ringing, elevators chiming, lives intersecting in countless ways. All the people he'd affected, knowingly or unknowingly, with his choices. "Your voice that night," he said to Clara. "It really was hope. Just not the way I thought." Clara nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Hope isn't about escaping consequences, Richard. It's about facing them and still choosing to do better." He picked up his pen, the same one he'd used to sign countless destructive deals, and turned to the first page of the document. The choice before him was stark but clear. Continue running from his past, or finally face it with the same courage he'd witnessed that night at the gala. "I'll need a witness," he said quietly, looking up at Clara. She stepped forward, her presence as dignified as ever. "That's what I've been all along." Richard began to sign, each stroke of the pen feeling like both an ending and a beginning. The voice of hope, he realized, hadn't just been about music. It had been about truth, about facing oneself in the mirror of one's actions, about the courage to begin again, not from denial, but from honest acknowledgement of who and what we've been. The city continued its eternal rhythm beyond the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding in one office, yet somehow connected to it all. A tapestry of lives affected by power, choice, and the endless possibility of change.